Model trains and kids sometimes go together fantastically, and sometimes not so much. So how do I keep my trains in good working order with my twin 4-year-olds? I'm going to tell you that, plus I'm going to answer a bunch of your questions today. Hey everybody, my name's Jimmy. Welcome to Coffee and Trains. Today I am drinking just some store brand coffee, whatever was in the pot really. If you want to tell me what kind of coffee you are drinking and have it linked just like these guys right down here, you can put that in the comments below and you might show up in an episode of Coffee and Trains. Also, this is a Q&A episode. I do these once a month, and if you would like to ask a question and have it answered on next month's Q&A, you can leave that in the comments of this episode below. Cheers guys! Let's start with Cade Strains 8317's question about ballasting. He says that he has his roadbed and track placed down and he's onto the ballasting stage, but he doesn't know if he should put ground cover down first. What are my thoughts on this? Well, if you've seen my process before, I typically go with the roadbed first, and I've got a pretty solid technique that I've worked out for getting that ground cover right next to the roadbed. I found that the roadbed spreading out over ground cover is a bit more distracting and unrealistic looking than when the ground cover sometimes gets into the roadbed, because then it just makes the track look like it's been there a little bit longer. So I typically go roadbed and ballasting first and then ground cover second. And I've done that in a video actually for MRR2, and I'll link that at the end. Andy Belt asks, if I pull up Kato Unitrack to reuse it, how do you remove the caulk that you use to hold it down? Well, one of the cool things about caulk is not only does it hold everything down, it's actually surprisingly easy to remove. Now, don't use a ton of it, but I use latex caulk to glue down my track, and it's really easy to remove. Some of this track on this layout is from 2 layouts ago, which is one reason why I use Kato Unitrack, because it ends up saving me money in the long run, since I like to build layouts every so often. But also the latex caulk is cheap and it's easy to take up your track once you have put it down. Now this only applies to Kato Unitrack with the attached bed. You're going to run into more issues with your standard set track and flex track because the ties can easily break off. But in terms of Kato Unitrack, I just typically am able to do a little bit of work and get the caulk off of there. Hot glue is a little bit different, but it's a very similar process. Chad McGicey 7546 asks, what is my opinion on turntables, pros and cons, and do I have a video on one? Well, I technically have a video on one, but I wouldn't really count that. Turntables are interesting, yes, especially if you're running steam and you have a yard area, you're going to want one on your layout. But they are, in my opinion, one of the more difficult things to put in on a model railroad. Not only because they require a lot of space and some slightly more precise engineering when you're putting down your track, but they also have the issue of electrical conductivity. Now, if you're buying a kit that's designed for this, it's going to make it a lot easier than just putting one in from scratch. But basically, you can run into the issue of doing short circuits if you're in DCC, because the wires might be opposite and you might create a short circuit. If I was going to do one, of course, since I run Kato Unitrack, I would take their turntable kit. I believe Walthers makes one as well, but definitely look at a kit if you're doing a turntable. They can add a ton to your layout, but they're definitely one of the more difficult things that you can pick to install in terms of track, mainly because of wiring and things like that. Model Railway Fan 38 asks, what non-sound DCC decoders do you recommend? The best overall budget options. So if you're going purely for budget, the best thing about non-sound decoders is most of them are very budget friendly. When I'm doing non-sound, I'll typically use Digitrack, sometimes I'll use Soundtracks or NCE or TCS. Those are all the brands that I run, and it just depends on what decoder I am using. If I am doing a Next 18, if I'm using a non-sound one, I'm typically looking at TCS or NCE. I think those are really the only ones that make the non-sound ones. And if I'm looking at a Kato Unitrack drop-in decoder or something like that, and I'm looking for non-sound, I'm typically going to be looking at Digitracks, which is very affordable. Atlas is the same thing for their drop-in decoders. If I'm looking at just general installs, it's going to go between Digitracks and Soundtrack's mobile decoders, which I've installed both of those, including installing a Digitrack or a Soundtrack's mobile decoder in my little switcher that I have from Kato that was my smallest locomotive that I've installed a decoder in. So really, if you're looking at budget, Digitracks is good for budget options. TCS, NCE, and Soundtracks has good budget options for DCC decoders as well. It just depends on what you want for your DCC install. Tia Edge 562 asks, how much detail do you think is too much? I know there's all kinds of items out there to put on your layouts. Well, it's really one of those beauty is in the eye of the beholder segments. Now, I do Inscale, so you're not going to get nearly as much into the nitty-gritty as you are with HO scale and other larger scales. And that's one of the really interesting things I find with Inscale locomotives when they are the different tiers that various manufacturers make. There's a certain point where you get to kind of a law of diminishing returns with Inscale locomotives in terms of how much detail can you put on that. It's not that they can't put the detail on there, it's that is it kind of worth it to have that detail because the locomotives are smaller. HO is a completely different ball game. You can go crazy detailed on those. But in terms of other details, it really depends on what you want. Some people really like those overly detailed scenes, and some people like those almost like cartoonish like scenes with a bunch of Easter eggs and things like that. And then some people just want a general representation of what something is. I tend to lean more towards a general representation with some detail, but depends really on the scene of how much I'm going to do in terms of detail. I could go crazy on an industry or something like that. But this is also because I'm an Inscaler. The larger you get, the more detail you're pretty much going to be putting in there because you have more space to work with and it's more visible. Pulidoa 1978 says that they are very new to this hobby and they can't find an answer to this question, so hopefully I can do that. He says it might be a silly question, but he's still DC and he bought an A, B, and C locomotives. Now, what that is basically it's 3 locomotives. So think of like an A unit for an F unit, so like an FA unit, and then the B and the C, just those additional power behind it. And he says he puts them on the track by themselves and they're drastically different speeds. So they're all running different speeds depending on the voltage. Does it hurt the motors or do I have to do anything when I run them together? Now, the issue here is that the motors are just different speeds and it's really just the differences in the locomotives. So yes, it can hurt the motors, but it's going to do more damage to your wheels, your gears, and things like that. The bottom line is it's not that great for your locomotives to be running together if they run at different speeds. Now, the only way that I know to solve this is to really you either make the locomotives, the extra ones, dummy units, which you saw a lot of dummy units with DC. That's basically a dummy unit is a locomotive without a motor in it. Or you really have to convert to DCC so you can speed match them. Speed matching is where you take all of the speed steps that come in DCC and you work them until the locomotives accelerate and decelerate together at roughly the same speed. So that's really what you got to do. Another thing it can also hurt is your couplers. If there's too much stress on your couplers, you can break them or warp them to the point where they won't couple well. So that's really the big thing. I would just, if I don't know if they're different manufacturers or the same manufacturer, that could be an issue. But if they're different manufacturers, that's probably where you're getting it because they might be using different motors. This is actually an interesting question here. Giles Kennedy asked me if I could do a general model railroad YouTube channel, which I think I kind of already do. I'm not sure. How can you help boost subscribers as you retain your evolution of the vision of the channel? Now, what he's basically talking about here is kind of a rule on YouTube if you're trying to grow. Now, this is a little bit inside baseball here, but basically, the best way I've heard it described is, let's say you want to get to 100,000 subscribers. What gets you your first 1,000 is not going to get you your first 10,000. And what gets you your first 10,000 is not going to get you to 100,000. And basically what that is that as your audience gets larger and larger and larger, your audience gets more disinterested and more general interest rather than specialists. So what I say here is basically you just got to increase the number of topics that you cover, which is something that I have tried to do. I still will do Arduino videos and 3D printing videos, but I don't do them nearly as much as I used to. And I'm just trying to cater to my audience more and more as it evolves. So basically, you're probably going to be looking at changing up and doing a little bit of evolution of your YouTube channel about every 18 months is the typical rule. But really, you just got to stay true to what you originally did and never lose that, which is why I still do Arduino stuff and 3D printing stuff. But you also have to explore new things like doing op sessions and showcasing different locomotives from different manufacturers and things like that, and just continue to broaden the type of content that you do. And you'll also want to look into analytics, but this is not the place to talk about YouTube analytics, so there's plenty of videos of that about that online. I will say that I pay attention the most to video creators and Think Media. Those are two great ones to check out. Big Dog 5899 is new to the hobby and says that before he builds his first layout, he watched a ton of YouTube videos, and he also built a 2x2 diorama for practice. Is there somewhere that he can go to get some professional critiques on what he's done? So there's a lot of train forums that you can go on, but I would also probably check out Facebook groups. A lot of model railroad Facebook groups are kind of closed off a little bit, so they're a little bit of a safer space. But please listen to me when I say this. There are people just like everywhere else on social media who are just straight up meanies, and you need to kind of take anything that's like really mean and brutal with a pinch of salt. Another thing you can do is start your own YouTube channel and use it as a way to send videos out to ask for professional help. Also, if you're someone who does this kind of thing on the side, whether it's layout design consultation or something like that, comment in the put a comment below so that maybe he can check that out and see that in there. So because there's not really a straight up place for model railroad critiques that are like constructive criticism. So that's a very interesting question. So, but those are a couple of avenues that I would pursue. Jean LaPlante 5972 asks, how do you install the camera in front of an Inscale locomotive? Well, this has a couple of answers. One, I've done a video on a very cheap camera that you can use, which is not that great of a quality, but it works. Another one that I used to love the GoPro Hero Session because it would fit, but they don't make them anymore. So the one that I found is the RunCam 5, this little guy right here. It's actually for FPV drone stuff, but it'll work just fine, and it makes most of the clearances. It probably won't make tunnels and super tight stuff, but this is something you can use. You can put it on a flat car that's pushed by your locomotive. Another one that is out there is Choo Choo Vision, which is for live streaming. It's something that I want to try at some point, and they have kits for HO and Inscale that you can install for live streaming from the cab of your locomotive. So there's a couple of different options out there. You just got to figure out which one's going to work the best. And another one that I want to try is the Insta360 Go camera. They just came out with a new one, and it's a really small profile, and I think it could do really well with Inscale. James Burba 1995 says that his son and him have just bought a 12K resin 3D printer and was wondering if I could give them some sources for some STLs for some Inscale models that they might print. Well, the first one's the free one, which is Thingiverse. You can find quite a few models on there. You'll just want to search things like Inscale model trains or Inscale buildings or things like that. Just keep searching until you find stuff. There's also a lot of the paid websites have them as well. The other one is, of course, on my Patreon. I've got a bunch of models that you can print at the $5 a month level. You can access the entire model railroad library on my website, DIYanddigitalRR.com. And that would be the couple of places that I know right off the bat. You can also buy a couple models as well from my Etsy store, which is linked in the description below. So those are some things that I would do just to start off looking for models. Pretty much any source you can find them now. There's enough modeling done out there that you can see it. Also, if you find like an HO scale model of a building or something, you can scale it down to 54% the size, and that will give you Inscale when you print. So hope that helps you out, Jim, and your son, Zach. JRH Productions 54 asks, what are some good Inscale manufacturers for locomotives and rolling stock? Well, I think that the gold standard in terms of just reliability and bulletproof is going to be Kato. Kato just works. There's nothing, they're not overly fancy. You can get them with DCC and DCC sound installed, but it's also really easy to install yourself. I don't think I've ever bought a pre-installed DCC Kato locomotive because they're that easy to install. The other good ones, I mean, Atlas is really good. I haven't had an Athearn Inscale locomotive yet, but I do have one pre-ordered, so hopefully that comes in soon, and I'll be able to tell you all about that. In terms of steam, I would say that Broadway Limited has really cornered the market for Inscale steam. I've got quite a few Inscale steamers for Broadway Limited, and they all run fantastic. They've even got their big boy even smokes now. Now, of course, Kato has some steam locomotives, but they're primarily a diesel company, and I'm trying to think if there is anything else. Bachmann's, I mean, pretty much everyone is solid at this point. If you're not solid, then you're going to run into issues because everyone else has nice solid locomotives. Now, for rolling stock, I really think if Kato's the gold standard for locomotives, Microtrains is the gold standard for rolling stock. They just make a really solid product. Not to mention they make pretty much the gold standard of couplers as well. I need to work on getting more of my couplers done. But Atlas also has good stuff. Athearn has good stuff. Bachmann's is solid. Broadway Limited, they have a bit less of a selection than some of the other ones like Microtrains, but what I have of them is solid, plus it has metal wheels. I'm going to be interested to see what Scale Trains does with the Exact Rail acquisition. I went and bought an Exact Rail car, and it's pretty good. It needs a few tweaks in terms of the trucks, but the detail is phenomenal. But pretty much most manufacturers are pretty good right now. The only one that I'll say that's readily available right now that's kind of a meh is just any of the cars that you get in a Bachmann starter set. They're not terrible, but they're going to be lower quality than pretty much anything else you're going to buy. So pretty much you're looking at, for locomotives, Kato, Atlas, Athearn, Broadway Limited, Bachmann, Intermountain makes some Inscale. There's quite a few manufacturers out there. And for rolling stock, really your gold standard is Microtrains, but you also have Atlas is good, Athearn is good, Bachmann is good, Broadway Limited is good. It's a great time to be a model railroader because there's no really terrible manufacturers. Okay, I think this was an auto-created name, but I want to answer it anyway. So I'm going to say user WI8TI30Q5F, I think that's their name, says they always wondered if I thought about a 7.5-inch gauge live steam. Is it something you'd ever consider getting into? Well, yeah, I would love to have that because I'm pretty sure that's the ride-on scale. Yeah, I would love to have ride-on steam. I actually just purchased my first little live steam locomotive for my garden railroad outside, so that's a thing. I'm still getting the hang of that. It's very interesting, but if I have the time, the space, and the money, I would love to get into running 7.5-inch gauge live steam. But I think right now it's something that I could not get into, and I got my wife to give me a garden railroad. Don't think she's going to be down for doing a big loop in our yard. Plus, I don't think I have enough space here either. But yes, I would love to try 7.5-inch gauge live steam at some point. Matthew Pearson 9238 asks, how do you keep your trains safe from your kids? Well, for those of you that don't know, I have twin 4-year-olds, and they do love trains, and I love sharing my trains with them. But 4-year-olds aren't exactly known for being the most gentle people, and they love their trains and they love to touch everything and like that. And you'll notice I don't have plexiglass over here, but basically two things. One, I typically keep the door closed and locked for the train room when I'm not in here. And 2, when I am in here and the kids want to run trains, I'm just always with them, and they know not to touch stuff unless I say they can touch stuff. It's something that we've worked on a lot. And the bottom line is I don't want to make it something that's like scary and they don't want to do it and they're scared of doing that. I want them to run the trains and learn how to run the trains so that at some point I can buy them starter sets for Christmas or their birthday and build them a little layout that they can get started out on, because that's how so many of us got started in this hobby. So the bottom line is that I just do 2 simple things where I'm just with them when I'm running the trains with them, and I keep the door locked otherwise, and they're okay with it. Whenever they ask to run the trains, yeah, I will go ahead and do that. My son asked me last night, he's like, can we go run trains? And I was like, absolutely, and let's head up there and run trains. He wanted to run the little Kato Pocket Line. He loves the little Kato Pocket Line little electric locomotive right there, so we'll run that a lot. He also loves running the call it the black trains, the Norfolk Southern diesels, so he loves running those in consist. So yeah, that's what I do. I love answering your questions. This is just so much fun. If you have questions that you would like answered for next month's Q&A, you can put that in the comments below. I want to hear them. Plus, tell me what kind of coffee you're drinking while you're at it. Until next time, guys, I'm Jimmy from the DIY and Digital. Stay safe, be kind, drink some coffee, and happy railroading.